Hello and welcome to the CX Files podcast for January 25th, 2024. My name is Mark Hillary and I'm in Sao Paulo, Brazil.
I'm Peter Ryan, but Mark, today I'm not in Montreal. I'm in our nation's capital of Ottawa, Ontario, where I'm doing a little bit of non-work related travel, visiting a site that we're doing an interview for another podcast I'm involved with, Cold War Conversations. But always good to be here, always good to be talking about CX, even with a bit of a Cold War mystique hanging over our discussion today.
Well, it's always good to be talking about other podcasts. And I do remember in 2019, we all took a trip out together. There was our friend Stephen Lloyd with us as well, and visited Berlin to make sure we were there for the 30th anniversary of the wall coming down.
Yes, that's right. It was certainly an adventure to remember. There were all sorts of different things I recall from that trip, many different beer halls, a visit to the Stasi headquarters, and some Uber escapades.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I certainly did frighten an Uber driver that weekend.
Well, the topic we're discussing today is not a frightening one. Actually, it's a really interesting one. And we couldn't have a better person as our guest today than Joe Garland. Now, anybody in the European CX space will know Joe. She's been around, she's held a variety of different roles. But the subject that I'm going to be interviewing Joe about today, Mark, relates specifically to a piece of research that she conducted a few years ago, and it was all about remote working. Now, Joe is somebody who is not just, I'd say, a commercial thinker, but she's very much a deep thinker. She likes to get into the science of CX delivery and what some of the different elements are. And Joe decided that a few years back, it would be worthwhile pursuing a master's degree and writing the thesis around how remote working can function within a CX environment, what some of the implications are, and really the direction that remote working was going to go. Now, what I think is fascinating in the discussion today with Joe is about how she compares and contrasted when she started writing the research, when she started doing the research itself out in the field, what she anticipated the results would be versus what they actually were. And look, you've done a master's degree, I've done a master's degree. I always think it's more illuminating when the initial hypothesis, the initial thesis that you have about the direction your research is going to go goes in a completely different direction. That's all about the light bulb. It's all about, wait a second, why didn't this turn out the way I thought it was going to go? What happened? Why did this happen?
I think that one of the things when we were talking about recording this intro, you were saying how a lot of the research comes down to employee experience and designing remote working to actually function in a way that kind of replicates the office experience as well. So I think it's really interesting that Joe went off on that track as well, because I think that one of the things that we saw during the pandemic was it's very easy to use tools like Teams and Zooms to have meetings and to stay in touch with your manager, but you can't replicate that environment of being with people, being with a complete team, being able to stick your hand in the air and talk to a supervisor. So there is the possibility of recreating this, but it's something that companies really need to think about and plan.
To my mind, I think that the discussion about yes or no on remote work, I think that that's a done deal. Remote work is a structural part of our industry. It's a structural part of a lot of different sectors now. And organizations are just dealing with it. The reality is figuring out the best way to make sure that agents in a CX environment are going to be engaged, that they're going to feel fulfilled, that they're not going to feel overworked. I think back to a quote from our mutual friend, Jim Farnsworth, years ago, when he said, people have to understand that remote work doesn't mean constant work. And that's something that many people learned the lesson the hard way around during the pandemic. But when you think about the discussion that we had with Joe, there's a lot of things that came out in terms of her research, some really good lessons learned that I think the listening audience is going to really appreciate as we talk a little bit about how an academic paper can very much be put into practical application in the real world.
Yeah, that's excellent. Well, I think, one of the things I've often said is that the failure of the metaverse has been because it's been presented as a way where you can a place where you can hang out and play ping pong. And the reality is, what we really need is virtual workplaces to really work well and really function so that you can create virtual teams. The sooner that some organizations start sort of focusing on that sort of thing, I think we will eventually see tech like the metaverse taking off.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been bubbling under the surface for a while, and there's a real practical application for it. But without further ado, let's hear what Jo Garland, our guest this week on the CX Files, had to say about her research, about remote work, and the direction that this manner in which CX delivery is going.
Okay, let's go for it.
So the CX Files this week is going to take a more academic term, something that we haven't done in quite some time. And I couldn't think of a better person to do it with than industry insider and veteran in the UK, Jo Garland, who joins us from her home in Surrey. Jo, it's always great to catch up with you.
Oh, thank you, Peter. Thanks very much for the invitation. Looking forward to our conversation.
Well, I am too. And I know that the United Kingdom has been hit quite badly the last couple of days with some pretty nefarious weather. How are things shaping up in your neck of the woods? Has the power stayed on?
Oh, the power stayed on, thankfully. It's been very wet, so lots of waterlogged places and flooding. But thankfully, in my area, the gale force winds didn't quite reach us. But yeah, it's some badly affected areas, fairly locally along the south coast, which hasn't been great. But thankfully, we're okay.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, and I hope that you stay okay. Winter has only just begun, and heaven knows that we're feeling it in Canada right now, where I woke up this morning and it was minus 7 degrees Celsius. It's only going to get worse for the next several months. Yeah, exactly.
Wow, that's cold.
The listeners to the CX Files are used to hearing me lament about the horrific winters that we've got in this part of the world, but let's talk about something a little bit more fun and positive. Now, you completed your master's degree at Henley Business School in 2021. And the reason we're catching up is to talk a little bit about the research you did in support of that master's in the form of your thesis. So effectively, you conducted some extensive research on the subject matter of employee experience in a remote CX environment. My first question to you, Jo, is what prompted you to engage this project as part of your academic study?
Okay, so I think there's two main reasons. I wanted to research something I was passionate about, but that would be a benefit to me and the industry. And we're always encouraged to research a topic that there's not a lot of research on. So nobody that I could find had ever had a research project on remote engagement in contact centres. So there was a real gap there. And at the time when we were going through COVID and partially through the lockdown, I felt it was a really important topic that needed to be addressed. So, it was just a great opportunity to really get into the detail about something that was quite important.
Yeah, and I really, really love it when people are writing academic papers about elements or topics that they really believe in or that they're passionate about. And going back to my own days as a master's student, when we had to put together those horrific methodological outlines about how we were going to conduct the research, as somebody who has spent 20 years researching the CX sector, what was your methodology? How did you go about putting together this research?
So, well, it was it was a learning experience. So first time I've ever completed anything like this. So adopted a qualitative approach, which was really detailed interviews. So that was only the first part of it. So lots of detailed interviews with varying levels of employees across the business to get a real good cross-section of views. But after those interviews, they were transcribed and followed an inductive coding method, which allowed me to really bring out the main themes from the data with the transcripts, that allowed me to build themes, sub-themes, and then understand the connections between all these themes that had come out. But it was a long, and you'll know this, Peter, it was a long, laborious process where the coding process takes weeks, where you're going through and noticing the language, noticing the repetition, and going back and listening to the recordings and noticing the level of emotion through the things that people were sharing with me around their engagement levels.
That's fascinating, and it resonates completely what you've just said in terms of the coding, in terms of listening for the emotion. And I have always been of the view that qualitative is just as important as the quantitative when it comes to any type of research. You can get the flavor for what the numbers are saying by actually speaking to people and finding those areas of commonality. Now, you raised an interesting point as well, that this was during the pandemic. Can you just give us a flavor for which time frame of the pandemic? Were we talking at the start? Were we talking in the middle, or when we were at that point where we were thankfully coming out?
Yeah, so it was towards the end, so we were still within that lockdown period, but we were getting back into a little bit of BAU. So one of the limitations of the research project is it was a very unusual time, but I thought what it gave me was some really rich findings in people's reactions to having enforced work at home, and then some return to the office. So it was that was super interesting. I can talk a little bit about that as we go through, but so it was a strange time. But what I got out of the research was kind of almost an accelerated finding, because people had to be at home, and some of the things that people had to do really illustrated some great engagement points, which I was able to discover.
Let's talk about some of those points right now. If you were to outline to me in 3 bullets, we'll just say, what were the 3 key takeaways that came out of the research you did?
So I think the 3 key takeaways for me were based around the key themes, and there are lots of key themes which we won't have a chance to go into all of them. But I think one of the most important key themes, the takeaways that come out of all of the interviews, every single interview, things that drove engagement were talked about around people's day-to-day role and the tasks they carried out. So the element of variety, the element of challenge in their role, and how that elevated engagement. And what we found during the time period was that actually when we were locked down, but people were necessitated to do other roles because everybody was stretched. But as we went back into some kind of BAU and that was taken away, levels of disengagement rose. And I think a key takeaway for me is that in the contact centre world, some of the roles are monotonous, and being able to create variety and challenge really does drive engagement. So that was one of my first key takeaways. The second one was around leadership, and we all know that the leader is an important, critically important role. But within this environment, it was so important because they needed to have different skills, they needed to be agile and find ways to support people with very different needs. So the role of the leader, which I can talk a little bit more about as well. And then just that interaction with the team, the dynamics of a team and how people work together. And this theme for me wasn't talked about in all of the interviews, but this was the one that elicited the most emotion, which really came out. So people felt if they didn't feel they belonged to a team or didn't feel they were treated fairly, that was really, really disengaging, almost to the point where it caused some feelings they didn't feel well, which I thought was really quite interesting.
Let's touch on that interaction for a second, because I remember, as I'm sure you do, at the start of the pandemic when everybody was forced to work from home, we had that Dunkirk-like shift from the contact center where people were grabbing a computer and going home and working. And all of a sudden we were being told, well, if we do group online aerobics classes on Zoom together, that'll give it a team feeling, which I think a lot of people eschewed. I don't know how effective these things actually were. But talking about the interaction, when we're looking at what an agent might have been feeling when they were asked or told that they had to work remotely, what were some of the methodologies or some of the techniques that were best or most effective in terms of keeping people engaged with their job and keeping them feeling like they were part of a team and that they were constructive?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that really worked well, that was really drove engagement, was virtual floor walking as well. So, we would have team leaders where usually they would be in the office walking around, creating that team ethos, providing support. We had a Google Meet that was constantly open, where we would have team leaders in the room and people would be able to drop in. I think you're right in the fact that, initially, team calls, that, endless quizzes that we all had to endure during COVID, pictures of pets and things. Initially, they were really good at building that team and people got to know each other. But I think as the weeks and the months went on, the reality of actually this is not going away anytime soon, those things did have a limited engagement impact. And so it was ensuring that there were processes in place to allow remote interaction. And for us, that was having a Google Meet room open all the time, virtual floor walking, and also a couple of the team members, which I thought this was just lovely. They would, where they used to sit next to each other in the office day after day, they would have an open video call all day, and they will be working separately but talking to each other like we're talking to each other now, as if they were in the same room. So a lot of emulating what they would do in the office, which was what people felt comfortable with, which was so important to feel connected to people at that time.
Joe, this is going to be a provocative question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. And I always, as having somebody who has written a master's degree myself, I had a lot of light bulbs that went on, and I also had a lot of point of views that changed, that preconceptions. So asking you, based on the research you conducted, what previous views or opinions did you have that were reinforced? And were there any preconceptions you already had that perhaps you changed your mind around?
Yeah, what a great question. So, I mean, the first one was the things that were really reinforced, and that were made so important in this environment, is just the criticality of the leader. So I'd always knew and understood that role is, super important. But what the research revealed was the interconnections between the themes. So the leader was able to support a role have variety or challenge. They were able to give people stretched targets. They were able to give people different jobs they wouldn't usually do. So the leader was able to make that happen for the people in the team. And they also were absolutely critical in creating a culture that promoted team dynamics. So they were the ones that were creating a sense of belonging, to making sure that people were connecting with each other, making sure that team still existed as a team. But also they were the people that enabled people to feel that they were equal. So, people were at home for the first time for a lot of people, and we didn't understand what people were doing. And so that leader was able to create that sense of equality, which was so important. So for me, I understood the importance of the leader, but it just came out in every single interview, and linked to all of the themes. So that was the one that really surprised me in the strength that came through. And then the other thing, I think, the thing that surprised me was that reward and recognition didn't really feature. at all in the interview. So a lot of organisations and businesses talk about reward and recognition schemes as a way to drive engagement. That didn't come out at all, and so I had a feeling that perhaps it didn't have a bigger impact as we thought, and people being paid correctly if they feel that is enough, their wage is fair. That's a bit of a hygiene factor for me. And what came out in the research was that any kind of recognition was well received, but didn't have a lasting impact on engagement, and that was a bit of a surprise.
Let's talk leadership. And I think that you're right. This is a huge factor, and something that really, I think, has evolved since the whole element about remote working has started. It's not even a case of just work from home anymore. I mean, it's really remote working we're talking about in CX to a very large degree. I don't buy into the argument that some people are making, oh, well, you can go do a CX job sitting in Starbucks. Clearly, from a compliance standpoint, that's not something that's going to be acceptable for many organizations. That said, not long ago, I was in Georgia, and one of the things that's powering their CX industry is remote working, but from co-working spaces where there are elements of compliance and so forth. So maybe could you talk a little bit about what your research showed in terms of how the leader has gone from what we would have perhaps established norms around in a contact center to one where you're either managing people completely remotely or in a virtual / on-site environment? How has this role changed over the course of the past few years?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is it has changed. I think this is a real challenge, because I think leaders, need to be agile in the way they manage people, and it's I think it's really challenging in creating teams that get the same experience whether you're at home, whether you're in the office. And I think it's even more challenging when you're in a hybrid environment where you've got some people in the meeting room and some people at home. How does the leader do that? So it has changed, and I think, I'm not sure we're there yet. I've seen organizations doing hybrid working training for leadership, but I think what's important is the leader understanding that everybody's an individual. So not everybody wants to work at home or in the office, but people will have different needs. So you might come into the office and not need any support, you might be at home and need a lot. So I think the leader that has it's going to require, even moving forward, even more well-developed skills in being agile, in managing those, matrix, remote, those varied teams. So yeah, and I think my research at the time just really revealed the importance of the leadership level, but also really thinking about how do you enable and empower that leader to really promote environments of trust with high psychological safety. So wherever you're leading teams, it should make no difference. And I think we spend a lot of time, don't we, talking about hybrid, remote, flexible, but really it's about true flexibility. And I think only part of that is the leader being able to manage in those ways. I think the organisation actually has got a big role to play in ensuring we've got processes and infrastructure to allow the leader to manage in the best way possible wherever their teams are located.
Okay, so going into our final question here, and by the way, thanks, Joe. This has been fascinating insight, and obviously the work that you did and the interviews that you conducted have truly given, I think, some amazing context to what we should be thinking about. So the final question I've got for you would be, before we end our podcast today, as remote work or hybrid work is becoming much more of a structural thing in our sector, and I don't think anybody would disagree, this is very much the case going forward. What do you see as the biggest challenge that providers are going to need to face down as they move into 2024 and beyond to make sure that whatever type of a virtualized environment they're going to be managing is going to be done as effectively as possible?
I think that's, for me, the biggest challenge is have you got the right leadership capability and skill to manage in this flexible environment? And secondly, do your processes, your structures, and your infrastructure support leaders to be able to drive engagement? So, a very quick example. How easy is it in a contact center for a leader to give a frontline agent a stretch task without going through numerous meetings with a planning department to get them time off the phone? So I think there's a whole, we really need to look at the structures and processes behind behind true engagement, so leaders can really flexibly be able to drive some of those activities. I think those are the two key points, really.
Well, Joe, thank you very much. This has really been, for me, very insightful. And I forgot to say this, but I'll say it now. Congratulations on the master's degree, and congratulations on
you.
some. No. It's a real achievement. It's certainly not something that is a walk in the park, having done one myself, and it was very challenging. But I think the rewards you get from this type of an endeavor are tremendous, and clearly what you're able to bring to the table, just in regards to the whole idea about managing remote teams, whether in CX or otherwise, is quite remarkable. So thank you very much for your time, and we look forward to having you back on the CX File soon.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Peter.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. We really appreciate your feedback and suggestions. You can reach myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan via LinkedIn. Please also leave a rating or review on your favourite podcast provider, as that helps more people to find us. As always, we'd like to thank Chris Haig at Traction Media for the CX Files graphics. See you next week. Hello and welcome to the CX Files podcast for January 25th. Let me do that again.